are on the quick trip lot. You are unlawfully assembled, and you will be subject to arrest. Please leave the quick trip lot.
There are communities out there that fear the police more than they fear criminals.
Hi, I'm Raihan Salam. Today, Vice meets Radley Balko, a reporter for The Washington Post and author of Rise of the Warrior Cop. Radley, thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.
So Radley, we know a bit about what's happened in Ferguson. There was an 18-year-old kid who got shot by a police officer, and that's pretty much what we know. And then the community erupted in tremendous tension, and then the police responded very, very aggressively.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are lots of things going on here. I think first is what we don't know is very important, and why we don't know it is very important. And I think that it has something to do with why the community reacted the way it did. So Ferguson has had cameras that police officers can wear, or dash-mounted cameras. For whatever reason, they decided not to use them. If that had happened, if they had used them as they were supposed to use them, we would know a lot more about what happened that day, and we would know a lot more about, who was at fault, whether the shooting was justified. I mean, I think a lot of, the community's outrage is just how the police have reacted to this. When the police chief in Ferguson first talked about the case, you remember he said something to the effect of, he knew that Brown was shot 2 times, but it may have been more than that, but not a lot more than that. And it was a very sort of kind of callous, kind of brushing off, not taking the situation very seriously. And I think that, aggravated a lot of people.
I cannot say at this time how many times the subject was struck by gunfire. It's hard to know. It was more than just a couple, but I don't think it was many more than that.
If you look at the timeline, there was a protest on Sunday afternoon that was peaceful. The police met that protest with a very heavy resistance, including a sniper that had his gun pointed at protesters. I think that really set the stage for confrontation. When you show up at a protest expecting violence, that tends to be self-fulfilling. The police begin to see the protesters as potential threats, not as people exercising their rights. And the protesters look at police and they see, when you show up in the riot gear, your face is covered and you've got, the sort of RoboCop gear on. And the police see them not as, people who are there, members of their community who are there to sort of keep order. They see them as this kind of nameless, faceless representation of the institution that they're there to protest against. So, when you immediately respond that way, and of course you have to be prepared, but when you immediately respond with the riot gear and the guns and the show of force, you immediately say to these people, this is not about you expressing your rights. This is about us, sort of telling you where your place is. At least that's how it's perceived by protesters.
So have there been incidents like this before in Ferguson? I mean, has there been kind of other cases of kind of police abusing their power?
So Ferguson has had a prior history with police problems. One recent example that was reported in the Daily Beast was 2009 when the police officers arrested this guy. I think it was outstanding warrant. He had been pulled over. It turns out they actually had the wrong guy, but that was sort of the least offensive thing that happened. They brought him to the jail. They severely beat him, and they then again, we're looking at issues of transparency. The jail actually had cameras that was supposed to record everything that happens in the jail. For whatever reason, they didn't happen to be functioning at the time that this guy was beating, which again, understandably raises a lot of concerns in the community. And then the guy himself was then charged with destruction of public property for bleeding on the police officers' uniforms. Turns out they had the wrong guy. The guy has since sued. Court threw out his lawsuit. I think he's going to have a pretty successful chance of appeal after all of this. But again, that speaks volumes about transparency, about credibility, and when an incident like that happens, it makes the community doubt their police force. I'd also point out, I think the demographics of Ferguson and the police force are very important. It's critical that a community sees itself reflected in its police force. Again, they need to see the police as members, drawn from their own ranks, who have chosen public service and are doing, using force when they have to protect the community, and it's important that the community see that the police have a stake in the community. When the community doesn't see itself reflected in the police force, when a black community doesn't see any black people wearing police officer uniforms, they see them as this outside entity that's been imposed upon them, and I think understandably. And by the same token, when the police don't see themselves in the community, it's hard for them to feel like they're a part of that community. And so you're going to be, you're going to see people less as human beings, as fellow citizens, and more as potential threats.
Is there a negative feedback loop here in which you have people in these communities who are alienated from the police and then become far less inclined to try to join the police? Is that part of what's going on?
Oh, yeah, I think absolutely. Not just join the police, but cooperate with the police. We saw, it probably started 8 to 10 years ago, the Stop Snitching movement. And a lot of people found that pretty repugnant, this idea that you shouldn't cooperate with police, even in, say, a murder investigation. And it was repugnant, but it was also a sign of something pretty remarkable and pretty terrifying, which is that there are communities out there that fear the police more than they fear criminals. Criminals who are committing violent crimes. We're not even talking about drug crimes here. And that is a remarkable commentary, I think, on the failure, I think, of a lot of police departments to connect with the communities they're supposed to be serving.
One of the things I find striking about Ferguson is that we've had incidents in which, confrontation between the police and the public has led to rioting even and kind of other kinds of civil disorder. But Ferguson seems to have captured the nation's attention to a different degree. And to some degree, I wonder if that flows from the fact that seeing police officers using military equipment has just been an image that hasn't sat well with a lot of Americans. This is something you've written about for a very long time. It's not a phenomenon unique to Ferguson. It's something we see all over the place, when police are dealing with protesters. And I kind of wonder, tell us a bit about where that comes from.
We have a long tradition in this country of being very averse to using the military for domestic law enforcement. I think history is replete with examples of where that's been allowed to happen. The results are usually not particularly good. So, in the U.S., I think we've respected that. There's a phrase called posse comitatus, which you often hear invoked. There's a lot of misconception about what the posse comitatus act actually does. But I think symbolically, it's important actually to what it means symbolically, even if it's not the literal meaning. And that's just this general aversion to the idea that soldiering is not appropriate in domestic policing, that soldiers have very different jobs from police officers. A soldier's job is to annihilate a foreign enemy. It's to kill people and break things. A police officer's job is to keep the peace and to protect our constitutional rights. And it's dangerous to conflate those two things. And we've done a pretty good job of keeping the military out of domestic law enforcement. I think where we dropped the ball, and by the way, I think one reason we've done such a good job is that most of the resistance when politicians have called for that has come from the military itself, which I think is a very healthy thing in a democracy.
The military doesn't want to be involved in domestic law enforcement.
No, and in the 80s, for example, members of both parties and the Reagan administration wanted the military to be actively fighting the drug war. They wanted Marines marching down streets and conducting drug raids. And there's really resistance from the military itself, I think, that prevented that from happening, which is a good thing. I think the military understands that, the importance of civilian rule, the military, and I think the military also understands the drug war is kind of a losing battle, and militaries don't like to be involved in losing battles. But we've done a good job of keeping the military out of domestic law enforcement, and I think where we dropped the ball is we've allowed domestic law enforcement to become increasingly like the military. And if your fear is about the mindset that a soldier's mindset is inappropriate to domestic policing, I'm not sure it makes much difference whether it's an actual soldier or a police officer who we've armed and dressed and trained like a soldier and constantly tell that he's fighting a war of some kind.
So essentially that has taken us to this point where the things that the founders were concerned about having, let's say, British military troops on American streets, have wound up happening in a different form. Is that what you're suggesting?
I think that's right. The historical aversion to using the military and domestic law enforcement does go back even before the American Revolution to when, as you said, the British troops were enforcing these general warrants in Boston, particularly. In Boston, I think that's one reason why Boston became such a hub of revolutionary fervor was because the tension that they saw when soldiers are enforcing laws, when soldiers can break into people's homes to look for untaxed goods, when soldiers can confiscate property without any sort of probable cause. This led to a lot of tension and ultimately led to the violence in the Boston Massacre, which sort of precipitated the American Revolution.
So it was a sense of being disrespected, and kind of for that population in Boston and the late 18th century, for this population in Ferguson, Missouri, just the sense that the police are not, or whoever's enforcing the laws is not respecting you, is not rooted in your community, is alien. That kind of engenders this tension?
Well, I think that's what's going on in Ferguson. I think historically it was just the wisdom that soldiers are not trained to deal with citizens of the same country. I mean, soldiers are trained to kill people. I mean, that's what they do. And when you have them in domestic law enforcement, that's always going to create tension. I mean, it's not what they're trained to do. It's not sort of the mentality that you recruit for in the military. And so I think, again, whether it's a soldier or it's a police officer who's acting like a soldier doesn't make much difference. One thing I've written about quite a bit is if you look at the recruiting videos that police departments send across the country to high schools and colleges, an uncomfortable percentage of them are images of cops, rappelling out of helicopters and tackling people and shooting things and kicking down doors. There's very little emphasis on community service and helping people. It's all about sort of kicking ass and taking names, generally set to blaring guitars or some kind of death metal music. And I think that's very illustrative of sort of where policing has come over the last 30 or 35 years. And I think that is another product of militaristic influence.
This is kind of an odd question, but the United States has been involved in high-intensity military conflicts for a pretty long time at this point, certainly since 9/11. And I wonder, when you're looking at the military, they've had to think harder about counterinsurgency. They've had to try to get military personnel to get out of that military mindset into a mindset of how do we protect a population, with enormous difficulty and with great resistance from the military for a lot of the reasons you're laying out. And I wonder, has there been some kind of convergence? Is there a way in which the police have been learning from what the military is learning from counterinsurgency? Is there a kind of feedback loop between those two?
Interestingly, I think not only has there been a convergence, I think that in some ways the police have become more militaristic than the military. I've talked to people who both went on raids in Afghanistan and Iraq and trained raid teams. And I've had them look at videos of police raids. For example, the raid a few years ago in Tucson, Arizona on Jose Guarena, who happened to be a veteran himself. And they'll look at these videos and they say, we'd be court-martialed if we did that. The not only just because of the lack of sort of respect for the rights of the people being raided, but also just basic safety. A lot of these SWAT teams get so little training, and it's very sort of gung-ho. I've had military people tell me that they, agree with my general criticism, but that they object to the word militarization because they don't, they say in the military we treat people better than you see in these videos. There is a convergence. I think it's interesting. I think it's also interesting that the military is increasingly acting like police officers when we're sort of occupying or trying to rebuild a country that we've gone to war with. Final I guess piece of evidence in my argument here is, if you've been watching TV in the last few days in Ferguson, one thing you've seen a lot of is actual military people, former military people, looking at the images coming out of Ferguson, and they themselves are alarmed by what they see. There's John Oliver on HBO played a clip of a former military guy, I think it was on CNN.
If you were actually in the military, you would know that you are not supposed to do that.
In the military, we're trained on something called escalation of force, which basically means the only time that you're really going to point a weapon directly at someone is when you're ready to pull the trigger.
He's talking about that very iconic image where you had the SWAT team pointing the guns at the unarmed guy in Ferguson. And he said, in the military, you're trained over and over again, you do not point your gun at anything that you don't intend to kill. And these police officers, they have all the military gear, they have all the military weapons, but they don't have that sort of restraint that's beaten into you in the military. I thought it was remarkable that you saw all this criticism from actual military personnel saying, this is crazy. They were alarmed by what they were seeing.
When you talk about the SWAT team, this is supposed to be something that is used in very rare particular circumstances. Yet it seems that military equipment is very widely available and very widely deployed, particularly in containing protests. How exactly did that happen? Because these are oftentimes very cash-strapped local governments. Where are they getting these arms?
I'm getting them from the military. And this 1033 program that we've heard a lot about has been in place since the 1990s, although informally it's been going on since about the early 1980s. But basically the Pentagon has been giving away surplus military equipment to police departments across the country. And a lot of it's sort of innocuous items like office equipment and computers and so forth. But a lot of it is guns and tanks and helicopters and grenade launchers. And bayonets. This equipment's being transferred to these police departments. And then, you combine that with these federal anti-drug grants, this money that goes just for drug policing. And then you put yourself, in a position of a sheriff or a local police chief, and you think, well, we've got all this cool gear. We might as well start a SWAT team because everyone else has one. And now you can keep your SWAT team in reserve and wait for one of the emergency kinds of situations where a SWAT team is appropriate, like a shooter situation or bank robbery or hostage taking, which probably isn't ever going to happen in your town. Or you can start sending your SWAT team out to serve drug warrants and start generating revenue for your police department, both through these federal grants and through asset forfeiture programs. And so what we've seen is just a dramatic spike in the number and use of SWAT teams across the country, from a few hundred per year in the late 70s to about 50,000 per year in 2005, the last time the criminologist Peter Kraska did a survey. But he estimates we're somewhere, 60 to 80,000 at least per year today, which is, the vast majority of those, again, are to serve warrants on people suspected of drug crimes.
Now, how much of this reflects just a desire on the part of police to minimize casualties, kind of force protection mentality? I guess you could say, hey, look, we need to come in with overwhelming force because we don't know what we're going to encounter. We might encounter, an armed perpetrator, perhaps, and so we need to, go in with this kind of shock and awe tactic.
That's the argument, and I think that's a valid argument when you're talking about somebody who is in the process of committing a violent crime. Somebody who has already shown that they have a potential for violence. When you're using that kind of force and violence against somebody who, not only hasn't already committed a violent crime, but is only suspected of committing a non-violent consensual crime, not only, I think, is that a disproportionate use of force in terms of, that person's particular rights, but you're also creating violence and confrontation where there was none before. When you're using a SWAT team in an active shooter situation, you're trying to save lives. You're using violence to diffuse an already violent scenario. When you break into somebody's house at 3 o'clock in the morning to serve a pot warrant, and I just wrote about a case today where a guy was shot and killed in one of these raids. You're eliciting a very primitive response in people. You're waking up and there are armed men in your home. What are you going to do? Even when drug dealers, hardened drug dealers shoot back at cops in these raids, I think it's entirely plausible that most of the time they think they're being robbed by rival drug dealers. I mean, even a drug dealer knows if you kill a police officer, you're not going to survive the next 5 seconds, and if you do, you're going to prison for a very long time. Drug dealers go into drug dealing to make money, not to kill police officers. I think these tactics actually create more danger than they, deflect or ameliorate.
Do they alienate the communities kind of where these raids are happening? Is that part of what's going on?
I mean, absolutely. I mean, if imagine you live in one of these communities and, it happens to you or it happens to your neighbor, and who wants to look out their window and see, armed men in black, huddling outside of a house, or who wants to see a tank parked across the street or an armed personnel carrier? I think it does, in these communities give the sense they're, sort of part of an occupied war zone, not, living in a free society.
Isn't part of the problem that if you're living in one of these high crime communities, the police often seem pretty arbitrary. They might use enormous force against one perpetrator, but there are 4 or 5 other guys who are, selling marijuana too, and no one really cares.
Yeah, and I think, when you're doing drug raids, drug investigations are notorious for relying on dirty information. You're getting information from informants, from drug addicts, from rival drug dealers, so it's not always accurate. So you're also, you add to the problem you just talked about, that you're not always hitting the right house. You add that, there's drug use and the drug laws are violated so frequently that there's no possible way you could sort of enforce them in any consistent manner. So it becomes very sort of piecemeal, and you end up you'd end up targeting communities that are easier to target, which tend to be low-income communities, minority communities, and of course that only leads to the mistrust. I'd point out in St. Louis County, which sent a lot of the heavy equipment that we're seeing in these images coming out of Ferguson. Last year, I actually reported on this. There was a local story where a SWAT team was sent to serve a warrant for an administrative warrant for a white-collar crime. And neighbors sort of notified the media because they were disturbed by what they saw. The media went to the St. Louis Police Department and asked for an explanation. In St. Louis Police Department, they said this last year. They said in St. Louis County, every search warrant is now served with a SWAT team, regardless of the crime. So we've gone, from a situation where, this kind of force is reserved for these volatile, situations where lives are at immediate risk to it's now the default use of force for any search warrant. It's not just St. Louis County. I mean, you're seeing SWAT teams used for increasingly petty crimes and regulatory enforcement elsewhere as well.
It's interesting because, you know, if I'm a police department, you referenced this earlier on, if I'm a police department, you know, I either get these resources or I don't. And you know, it's kind of essentially coming to me for free. Now, normally if you were giving me cash, then I might deploy it in all kinds of different ways. I might use it to, let's say, invest in more community policing initiatives or something like that. But if you're saying, well, we'll give you weapons for free, this other stuff you're gonna have to pay for yourself.
When you combine that with the anti-drug grants and the fact that the tactical teams and the SWAT teams are primarily used for drug enforcement, the other thing it does, I mean, it places a much higher priority on that kind of policing. It also gives those units a lot of clout within the police department because they're generating revenue that, you know, benefits everyone else. So, you know, you get to the point where the SWAT team becomes sort of a very elite unit, both in terms of the tactics and the training, but also in terms of the influence that they have. And they can start, you know, lobbying to expand their mission like any other sort of government entity does. They want to continue to justify and expand their existence.
The thing that to me that's interesting about Ferguson is that you have two separate things at work here. You have the initial concern about the use of force against this 18-year-old, and then you had this huge response to the protest. Yep. And so I'm curious about just protest in general. Like when you think about images from the 1960s and the civil rights struggle, you have all these iconic images of police and police brutality. And you know, the 1968 Democratic National Convention, you have police putting down protesters in a very aggressive, forceful kind of way. Then, since 1999, the Seattle WTO anti-globalization protests, you have this other kind of moment. What happened in between? Was there a response to that initial, that 60s era police brutality that changed the way we do policing in this country?
Well, there were a couple of what I would consider good examples of police departments that handled protests in a very different way, and I would say with pretty encouraging results.
And they kind of learned from that experience,
right?
Earlier era.
So a good example is Jerry Wilson in Washington, D.C. He was appointed police chief in 1969, and he's still around. I actually interviewed him for the book, and he was took a very non-confrontational approach to protest. And his philosophy was, again, you know, if you show up expecting violence and confrontation, you're going to get it. So he would put his officers in their police blues, and they would be the front lines. You know, you could see their faces, you could see their badges and their names, and they would interact actually with the protesters. And he would talk to the protest leaders ahead of time, talk about what their goals were. The idea was to see yourself as a facilitator of protest, not a container of it. Now, you know, things can get out of hand. So Wilson said he always had his riot squad nearby, but they would be, you know, on a bus on a side street or, you know, in a building nearby if he needed them. But that's not what you send out initially. So I think that model, you know, it was adopted in some other places. San Diego with Norm Stamper, who would later be in charge in Seattle and now regrets his response there. But, you know, there were few and far between. Joseph McNamara, actually in San Jose, took a very sort of community policing approach to both protest and just policing in general. Again, with great results. You know, the crime rate dropped pretty dramatically. Oh, and actually in D.C., I should say, during Wilson's tenure, the crime rate actually dropped while it went up pretty dramatically across the rest of the country. So, you know, not only does community policing not sort of make things, you know, not only is it not soft on crime, there's actually some evidence that it works and that it gets the community cooperating with police. And, you know.
And what was it in 1999? I mean, so was there a kind of unlearning of these lessons from that earlier era, or what happened? Well,
I think what happened was there were a couple of protests in Europe before the WTO protests that did get out of hand and got violent very quickly. And so, and I also interviewed Norm Stamper for my book, and Stamper was worried about this. He had seen what happened, and so his goal was to make his officers as prepared as they possibly could be for this protest. And so they got hours and hours and hours of training. He ordered new equipment, which he refers to in the book as Darth Vader gear. And you know, he was so confident going in the protest that he had covered all of his bases. Interestingly, his officers were nervous. Like they were very apprehensive about what was coming, and it was because they had been sort of told over and over again through all this training to expect violence and to expect things to go wrong. And sure enough, they did. And it all started with there was a protest in the middle of an intersection. They were trying to shut down a street, which of course, you know, is trespassing, but it was not violent. They weren't harming anyone. They weren't destroying any property. And Stamper, one of his commanders, I think Stamper actually gave the order, tear gas them. And to make things worse, they actually shot the canisters behind them. So when the protesters were running away from the gas, they were running right into the police, which, as you might imagine, created a lot of problems. That turned violent, and then sort of the violence kind of spilled out all over the city. Reports afterward, both the Seattle and Washington State, I think there may have even been a federal report, found that basically the police response is what instigated the riots, and that the police were paranoid, that there were all sorts of false reports about what was going on around the city. The reports of Molotov cocktails being thrown, which turned out not to be true, and it was basically what every report that looked at the WTO protests concluded was that the officers were just way too sort of conditioned to expect there to be violence. And Stamper defended his decision up until about 5 or 6 years ago. And it was really, he said, it was the Occupy protest and watching the police response to the Occupy protest. And he was really troubled by in how many cities he saw that the sort of the Darth Vader gear and the riot gear was the default response, that was what they came out with initially. And he looked back at the riots and he said, he said it breaks his heart now. He said it was the biggest mistake of his career. So, there are different approaches, and there are approaches that work. And I should say that Stamper was a champion of community policing in San Diego. He did some great things, as he was rising up to the ranks in San Diego. He was a champion of community policing in Seattle. I think it was just this one particular event and the violent protests in Europe that preceded it that may have, sort of clouded his judgment.
So obviously we don't have a very clear understanding of what's happening in Ferguson now. You're getting conflicting reports, but one thing that we've heard is that there was this effort to de-escalate.
Yep.
The state police were brought in, the state highway police were brought in, partly because there was so much distrust in the community with the Ferguson police. Yet there are reports that there were provocateurs, there were people who were using Molotov cocktails, et cetera. Now again, we don't know very much about these reports, but it does seem as though when you've got a protest on this scale, it's sometimes going to attract people who are bad actors.
Yep.
What do you think about that? I mean, and how should the police respond?
Well, I would say one thing, when the state police came in and the commander came in and actually met with protesters and gave them hugs, I believe, and was sort of chatting with them and talking, about what their concerns were. That first night was peaceful. It was the most peaceful night we've had in Ferguson since, in a week. Things didn't get violent again until the next day when they called the press conference and released the officer's name along with the security video, basically trying to assassinate Brown's character. And, if he committed an armed robbery, obviously he may have had some character problems. The officer involved wasn't aware of that video, so it doesn't really say anything about the justification of the actual shooting. And I think people saw this as an attempt by the police to kind of smear Brown, to deflect attention away from themselves. And so I think it was that following night that you started to see things flare up again. Now again, this is, when you when you have conversations like this, there's always a risk of being perceived as you're excusing the looting or the rioting, and of course that's awful. Nobody excuses any of that. And when people are actually breaking laws and destroying property and harming other people, you do need a forceful response. I mean, it has to. You have to stop that. I think the problem is the blanket kind of saturated response that we're seeing. That you're seeing guns pointed at people who are unarmed and are just merely protesting. You're seeing tear gas being fired at journalists, and you're seeing journalists being arrested, another distinction I'd like to make when we talk about why it's particularly troubling when these things happen to journalists, it's not because journalists are special people who deserve special rights. It's because it indicates that you have authorities who want to clamp down on the flow of information, and that's, I think, particularly troubling. But so, I think it's perfectly justified to use heavy force when you are facing an actual threat, when lives are at immediate risk. Again, sending the SWAT teams out, after people who are committing arson and shooting people, or the reports of armed gunmen in the area, it makes perfect sense. I think it's that every protest is being met with this kind of force that is troubling.
Yeah, I mean, we're at this point so deep into a process that's been spiraling out of control that it's hard to say. Because when you start with a kind of forceful response, then perhaps it's kind of natural that people are going to first of all, it's going to attract provocateurs and agitators. Yep. That might not have happened at all had you not had the initially forceful response.
I mean, it's always hard to sort of engage in counterfactuals. Who knows? But One thing I think we could say pretty confidently is that if, there had been a dashboard camera and a lapel camera and a lapel microphone on this, we would have known a lot more about what happened.
So this is a really interesting question because a lot of people have reacted to what's happened in Ferguson with this notion that we need body cams. We should have, as a default, that police officers are wearing these cameras and recording their interactions with the public. Yet you said that, in Ferguson, you actually did have these dashboard cameras. And there are others who've raised the possibility that, you're still going to have different narratives, even if you do have videotaping of these interactions. So what's your thought about that?
More evidence is always better than less evidence. And if you can have an unbiased narrative, even if it's not the complete narrative, it's better than not having an unbiased narrative. So all we have, is the narrative of the police officer and the narrative of the friend who, may have been implicated in this prior incident. Nobody knows who to believe. Now, if you had video, you could, particularly a video of the actual, if things happened the way the police officer said, there would be audio of the struggle, right? There'd be audio of the first shot that was allegedly fired from the police car. We would see how far the officer was away from Brown when he shot him. All these things that we have really sort of nagging, pertinent questions about, I think, would be answered if we did have video. Having an unbiased narrative is going to be useful, even if it's not complete, even if, we would know what happened. If the officer's version of events is correct, we would hear a struggle on the audio. We'd probably see a struggle. We would see how far away the officer was from Brown when he shot him. We would see if Brown's hands were in the air when he was shot. It would illuminate a lot of the things I think that are really the nagging questions that I think that are people are worried about, and that they feel that the police aren't being completely transparent about. The video. I've written a lot about a video about dash cameras and about lapel cameras. One thing you often see, which I've already mentioned, is that these cameras can conveniently malfunction at critical points. So I think if you're going to institute a policy like this, you're going to have the lapel cameras and the dashboard cameras. I think you also need a policy that says basically, it's up to the police to preserve and protect this evidence. If the evidence goes missing in a case, there's going to be a presumption by the courts that the evidence would have validated whoever's making the complaint against the police officer, or whoever the police officer is, whoever's being prosecuted. Now, that presumption can be overcome, but the burden is then on the state to overcome that presumption. The way things currently stand, and the Supreme Court has even ruled on this, if video evidence goes missing, there's a presumption that it was accidental and there's really nothing the complainant can do about it or the defendant can do about it. So, I think we do need that. The fact that the cameras in the jail malfunctioned during that 2009 incident, and that, the guy can't get into court because that video doesn't exist. I think, there should be a law saying, it's up to the police to preserve and protect the evidence. If they don't, it's going to be a tougher legal hurdle for them.
When you think about the resentment building up between police and the communities they serve, one thing you've brought up in the past in your writing is this idea of the criminalization of poverty. What exactly do you mean by that, and how does it manifest itself?
I think it's a result of, part of it's a result of, communities that are, tax bases are sort of drying up, or, we're in a long-term economic slowdown. And so communities are looking to new sources of revenue. And so one thing they're looking at is, these petty offenses and petty fines. Ferguson is just one of several dozen towns that sort of rim St. Louis. And they're all very small. They're all about Ferguson size or smaller. A lot of them, in a particular area, are majority black, very poor, not a lot of property values. There's not a huge tax base, and a lot of these, towns fund themselves with their municipal courts. And the kinds of crimes that go to municipal court tend to be very low-level petty crimes, like jaywalking or driving without a license, speeding, very, very kind of low-level misdemeanor infractions. The problem is, when that's your source of revenue, there's a temptation to sort of prioritize policing for those kinds of crimes.
You might even have quotas. You're expected to, generate this much revenue in fines.
Right. You might have quotas. We've seen examples with, for example, red light cameras, which generate lots of revenue for municipalities, and we've seen examples of the municipalities shortening yellow lights to generate more red light infractions, which is dangerous. It puts public safety at risk. I think it's also dangerous when police departments are told to prioritize these kinds of low-level offenses, because you're doing that at the expense of actually policing in a way that promotes public safety. So if you're one of these communities, I mean, imagine you live in Ferguson and it's a town that derives a significant stream of revenue from these petty offenses. You have basically an all-white police force. You're a town that's 67% black, and these police officers have been instructed to find ways to extract money from you for very low-level petty offenses. I mean, it isn't difficult to see how that can become bitterness to resentment to sort of an explosive kind of powder keg waiting to happen. As time goes on, and it's not just Ferguson. I mean, there are lots of towns, in this particular area, and I happen to be somewhat familiar with St. Louis, but I'm sure it happens in other cities too.
Now, one thing that's surprising is that, given that there are so many people in these communities that have had these adverse experiences with the police, and the criminalization of kind of various petty crimes as a kind of way of harvesting revenue, why hasn't there been a political backlash?
I mean, that's a good question, and I've talked to sources in St. Louis. Why do you have a town that's 67% black and has one black member on its city council? You'd think that the sort of sheer demographics, the numbers would produce better representation. Part of it, I think, is just voter participation, but part of it is also how many of these people have felony records. I mean, in Missouri, if you get pulled over twice for driving with a suspended driver's license, you can be charged with a felony. So if you think about how that plays out, if you're a poor resident of one of these towns, you get pulled over for some sort of traffic violation. It's it's a $80 offense, but because there's this trend where cities and states are adding assessments and court fees, and by the time you add all that stuff up, your $80 offense is now, say, $500. You can't pay it. You can't find daycare for your kids to go to court, to fight it. So you get the fine doubles because you don't show up in court when you're supposed to. Now it's up to $1,000. Your license gets suspended because you haven't responded to these traffic moving violations. You can't stop driving, right? You have a job, you have kids to support. If you're a father, maybe, if you stop driving, you can't go to your job, you can't pay child support, you get arrested for not supporting your kids. If you're, a mother, you continue driving, you get pulled over a couple times for having a suspended license, now you've got a felony. And so it adds up very quickly for these people. And, once you have a felony, you lose your voting rights in Missouri. So, that's one, I think, explanation for why that's been able to happen. But I think another explanation is more kind of historic, long-term historic, and that's just that these were for a long time, these were white towns. These were white people fleeing basically St. Louis for the suburbs. And so even though, they become majority black or majority Hispanic in the last, 10, 15, 20 years, you still have a pretty strong white kind of power structure that I think is, difficult to overcome, particularly given all these other obstacles.
Have there been any political efforts to try to reverse this, to address the criminalization of poverty?
I think we're starting to see it more and more, I would say, just in the last couple of years. I mean, I think people are starting to draw attention to this issue. I think, one interesting thing, groups like the NAACP and, groups on the progressive side of things have been, trying to raise alarms about this for a long time. I think, interestingly, you're starting to see groups on the right start, to make noise in this direction. And I think, there's an understanding that if you're of the political persuasion that emphasize the importance of a family structure and an intact family unit, these laws peel away at that. These laws pry families apart. There's a story, actually one story in Ferguson. I was just told by an attorney where a guy had to be in court. He brought his kids, couldn't find daycare for his kids, brought them with him. Kids aren't allowed in the courtroom, so he leaves the kids in the car. Well, the police had people in the car or in the parking lot waiting for people who weren't permitted to bring their kids in the courtroom. He leaves his kids in the car to go to court. He gets arrested for abandoning his kids. So I think we're starting to see more. I think people on the right are starting to see how this affects the issues and the values that they care about, and that it's eroding at those as well. So I think that's encouraging. I hope we see more of that, and I hope the sympathy that we've seen for the residents of Ferguson, I hope that it isn't overcome by, a lot of the, I think, justified, revulsion at the violence and the looting that we're seeing, because I think there's a problem that goes way beyond the violence.
The militarization of U.S. police forces has gone in one direction for so long, How do you see it flipping around? Because I think that if I'm a police officer, if I really am concerned about force protection, I'm concerned about my safety, how do you convince people that, well, wait a second, you might be safer by not going in with a full SWAT team to serve every warrant or whatever else? I mean, how does that happen?
Politicians need to stand up to police officers. I mean, they've been reluctant to do this for a long time, to stand up to law enforcement interests. Sort of whatever they say, we just sort of believe them. And I would direct some criticism to the right side of the political spectrum here, where for a long time conservatives have understood that the guy, the paper pushing bureaucrat at the EPA who has a PhD in public management or some sort of public affairs doesn't know everything, and he's susceptible to the trappings of public choice and bureaucratic turf wars, and I agree with conservatives on all of that. The problem is, when it comes to a police officer, I mean, you take a kid out of high school and you give him 6 weeks of academy training and a badge and a gun and the power to detain and arrest and kill people. And for I think too long on the right, there's been this sense that they are not subject to the same sort of trappings of public service that the bureaucrat is, that we shouldn't question their judgment. And I think we should. I think we need police. I think police are important. Same with prosecutors. But I do think that, particularly given the powers that they have, that means they deserve more oversight. So I think that's part of it. I think more cynically, I think we are going to see a reform because we're seeing so much mission creep among SWAT teams. We are increasingly seeing governments willing to use more and more force for increasingly petty offenses. And I think as that happens, this is a very cynical view, I admit, but as that happens, you're going to start to affect people outside the traditional communities that are affected by this. I don't think it's any coincidence that the first state to pass any sort of SWAT reform bill was Maryland, and it was passed after a mistaken SWAT raid on a mayor of a town in Maryland. Once the political class starts to be affected, the political class starts to get worried. I actually spoke to a staffer for a very conservative congressman. The staffer had been trying to bring militarization to his boss's attention to no avail. The boss was then doing a tour of the FLETC, the law enforcement training seminar in, I believe it's South Carolina, and he saw a bunch of IRS agents training with AR-15s. And this made him very concerned about police militarization when the IRS starts, getting in on it. So I think as you see, regulatory agencies increasingly militarizing and using more and more force, you're going to start affecting people who have a platform, who have some political clout, and who are going to get angry about it. And we're seeing that. I mean, you see, Rand Paul has been speaking out against police militarization. Chris Stewart, I believe his name is, congressman in Utah, has been speaking out against a conservative Republican from Utah. And so we're seeing, I think we are starting to see people outside these traditional communities. It's unfortunate that that's what it's going to take. You'd like to think that we're all concerned when it affects people who aren't part of our community. But I think as it gets worse, it's going to get better.
Thanks very much for joining us, Radley. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure.